friends, I am Dr. Pranav Khoche from Nutan Vidya Prasarak Mandals, Arts, Commerce and Science College, Lasalgaon. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss figures of speech, part 1. In this part, we will be discussing simile, metaphor, conceit and personification. But before that, we must understand the concept of figures of speech. Definition of figures of speech can be discussed in the following way. Figures of speech are the devices or the arrangement of words. Devices, language devices, or the arrangement of words in order to beautify the language of poetry. Here, the devices means not any equipments, but the use of language in order to beautify the language of poetry. The use of words in order to make the poem or lines of poetry effective. The poet uses figures of speech intentionally and consciously. The poet does not use figures of speech just like that. No. He uses them intentionally and consciously for a particular emotional, visual, or sound effect. How does a poet do that? We will see that afterwards. The figures of speech do not only decorate the poem, they are not only decorations. Please remember this. Though they are called alankar in Marathi, but they do not only decorate or beautify poetry, but also put forth the message the poet wants to give in effective and intense manner. We have seen in the definition of poetry that words are arranged in a particular way. They are chosen for their sound effects, for their ideas and images they suggest, right? So these words are chosen. Likewise, figures of speech are also chosen and consciously used by the poet, because poetry is an art of indirection. The poet wants to give his message in minimum words, and in that particular manner, figures of speech help the poet immensely. Therefore, figures of speech are important, they are significant in poetry. Almost in any poem, they are integral part of that particular poem. Now we will see the figures of speech, which are also called devices of comparison. They are mainly simile and metaphor, but we will also discuss conceit or metaphysical conceit and personification in this particular lecture. The very first figure of speech in our list is simile. Simile is perhaps simplest of the figure of speech. It is a comparison between distinctly different things or object, indicated by the words like or as as. Generally in simile, two distinctly different things, they are quite different from each other. They are not similar to each other, but still there is comparison. So simile is a comparison between distinctly different things or objects, and this comparison is indicated by the words like or as as. It means that in simile there must be these words of comparison present. Otherwise it won't be a simile, then it can be a metaphor or any other figure of speech. But in simile, in any simile, the words of comparison like or as must be present. A very famous example I have given here. My love is like a red, red rose. You can see the word like in bold. My love is like a red, red rose. This is the very first line from the poem A Red, Red Rose by Robert Burns. So in this line, the poet compares his love with red, red rose. With a red rose by using the word like. Now, why does he compare his love with a red rose? First of all, you must have understood by now that this is a simile. My love is like a red, red rose. First object is compared with, that is my love is compared with a red rose. He wants to, now this figure of speech here shows, expresses the intensity of his love as well as freshness of love. Therefore, he has compared it to a red rose because the color red shows intensity as well as it also indicates the freshness of that particular rose. Second simile is from the Rime of an Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge, the famous romantic poet S.T. Coleridge. An ice mast high came floating by. An ice mast high came floating by. Mast is the long pole rising from the deck of a ship. It also supports other parts of the ship. The masthead or mast is generally the highest part in any ship. So he says, an ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. Here there are two things. First of all, he says that ice itself was mast high, that is as high as mast. So this can be called a comparison, but it is not clearly a simile. Right? But the second phrase in the line, the second part of the line, an ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. What does he see? What does he see in the sea, in the ocean? That there was a big, very big piece of ice that was floating and it was green in color. But how was that green color? It was as green as emerald. So here the comparison is between a very big piece of ice and emerald. What is an emerald? Emerald is a precious green stone. Lalapan Marathit we call it Patsu in Marathi. So as both are green in color. In the next slide, you can see both of these simile in pictorial form. See, the first simile we discussed, my love is like a red, red rose. You can see here this picture of beautiful rose, fresh rose, very red rose, right? So, my love is like, the word like is important here because it makes the sentence as a simile, the line as a simile, right? The second simile is, an ice mast high came floating by, which was as green as emerald. Here you can see this iceberg. Iceberg is generally a very big piece of ice. It is very big. At the same time, it is green. And how is that green? Like it is like a dark emerald. It is like a dark emerald, that precious stone. So therefore now you must have understood both these similes and also the figure of speech simile itself. The next figure of speech, it is almost like a simile, but there is a difference, which is called metaphor. Metaphor can be called implied simile, or some people also call it a hidden simile. Metaphor can be called implied simile because it compares two dissimilar things or objects or ideas. Like the simile compares two dissimilar or distinct things or objects or ideas without using the words of comparison. So, the metaphor is called an implied simile because it is also like the simile, it is also a device of comparison. But at the same time, it does not use the words of comparison like or as. See the following examples. Life is a dream. Life is a dream. So life is compared to a dream, something which is not permanent. Life is like a dream. As the dream breaks and we wake up, life is also temporary, right? Therefore, life is compared to a dream, but here we say life is a dream. It is not life is like a dream. It means the same, one and the same, that life is like a dream. But instead of using like, the word of comparison, we say life is a dream. Now what happens here in metaphor? Because we say life is a dream, it becomes more effective than saying life is like a dream, right? Still it is comparison. All the world is stage and all men and women merely players. This is a famous line by William Shakespeare. You must have heard it. Shakespeare says all the world is a stage and all men and women merely players. There are two comparisons. In the first comparison, Shakespeare compares the world with a stage. He compares our world in which we are living like a stage of drama, stage of a play, stage of a drama. And second comparison, second metaphor is all men and women. So all the people in the world, we are just actors. We are just actors. There are no words of comparison. Still, this comparison becomes very effective. So Shakespeare compares the world to the stage of a play and all men and women to actors without using any words of comparison. Right? He further says in the same line, in these lines, he further says that everyone has his own entry and exit. Like in a play, the actors enter from one side and exit when they play their role, and when their role is finished, they exit from the stage. In the same way, like actors, we also come to this world, we play our parts in this world, we live our life, and then we exit from this world. The next metaphor is also a line from William Shakespeare. It is a sonnet. It is a line from a sonnet. And here he says, it means love, it is a star to every wandering bark. This line compares love with the pole star. You know the pole star. It always indicates direction. So this particular line compares love with the pole star. It is a star to every wandering bark. Here bark means ship. Every lost ship or every traveling ship, it used to take. Now there are so many modern devices, but in so many instances, in so many examples, we have seen that the ships depend, or at least used to depend, on the pole star for direction. Like that pole star, love gives direction, true love gives direction to our life. Like the lost ship, like the wandering ship, if we are lost, if we are wandering in our life, true love can help us to get the direction and start our journey in true meaningful way. So you must have understood friends, that Metaphor is just like a simile. But the difference is, while in simile there is use of words of comparison like and as, metaphor uses or metaphor does comparison without using words of comparison. Okay. The next figure of speech is conceit or metaphysical conceit, because metaphysical poets in 17th century used to have ample use of this particular figure of speech. It is a figure of speech which compares between two objects. It means comparison between two completely dissimilar things. So, as a figure of speech, conceit means that there is a comparison, but those two objects of which are compared with each other, they are completely very different from each other. It establishes striking comparison. You are struck. We are struck as readers when we read such conceit. We are struck by the difference, by the distinction between those two objects. It establishes striking comparison between two very dissimilar things or situations. We cannot imagine, especially when we talk about metaphysical poetry and the conceits used in metaphysical poetry, the comparisons. It can be a simile, a conceit can be a simile, it can be a metaphor. Please remember this. Sometimes it can also be a personification, but it is so much far-fetched comparison. It is very much far-fetched. It is very much stretched comparison between two very different objects. And generally, we are shocked when we see such comparisons. So it is a far-fetched comparison which was brilliantly used by metaphysical poets like John Donne and Andrew Marvell. Here is an example of metaphysical conceit. The poet says, he, that is love, is a tyrant pike. That is, pike is a big fish. Our hearts, the fry. The fry is a small fish. Very small fish are called fry. So, this line is from the poem Broken Heart by John Donne, the most famous perhaps metaphysical poet. He says that love is the tyrant fish, a big fish, and our hearts, human hearts, they are like a small fish. We are shocked here when he compares love, an emotion like love, very beautiful emotion like love, to a tyrant like cruel pike, a big fish, we are again shocked when he compares our hearts with the small fish. Here he means that love, like the tyrant pike, he swallows our hearts, it destroys our heart. Right? So, therefore, as I earlier said, that such comparisons always stun us, surprise us, and shock us, because this is a very dissimilar and unusual comparison. What is an unusual comparison? That love is compared to pike and our hearts are compared to small fish. The last figure of speech in our lecture today is personification. What is a personification? The name itself suggests something. Personification, person and personification. So, in personification, a non-human thing, please concentrate on this phrase, a non-human thing is referred to as having human characteristics. Again, I read the line. In personification, a non-human thing is referred to as having human characteristics. In other words, when human qualities or attributes, when qualities of a human being or attributes of a human being are given to non-human things, as well as abstract ideas, emotions, concepts. This particular structure or use is called personification. Personification, this word itself, the title itself suggests so many things. In your school days, you might have written essays like an autobiography of an umbrella, an autobiography of unwritten later, right? Unreturned later. So, what were those essays? In those essays, when you put human qualities and human emotions to that particular umbrella or to later, or for example bicycle, you you used personification. There are some examples, some brilliant examples given here. In the first example, John Donne rather addresses the sun as, "Oh busy old fool, unruly sun." This is quite shocking personification, because he begins his poem, The Sun Rising, a metaphysical poem, by calling the sun as busy, that is, here it means interfering, old, and most shockingly, fool. He calls the sun as fool. So, being busy, being interfering, being old, and being especially being fool, and unruly. Unruly means who does not behave according to rules. Who does not behave according to rules. So, he calls the sun, he gives the sun these human characteristics, these attributes, because interfering are only human beings, fool are only human beings, and unruly are also only human beings, and these human attributes are given to the sun. Right? The sun itself is non-living, non-human, but the poet addresses it as a human being. The second example is very famous, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. This line is from Daffodils, a very famous poem, a very renowned poem by William Wordsworth. So, the poet gives the attribute of dancing to non-human flowers in this particular line. He says that when he saw those daffodils, they were dancing in the breeze. Now, we know that only human beings intentionally dance. But here, flowers, daffodil flowers, the yellow beautiful flowers, are seen as dancing. Therefore, it is personification. Here are two more examples of personification. William Shakespeare says, he, in the poem it means love, he is not time's fool. Here Shakespeare addresses love as he, therefore love has been personified. At the same time, time's first letter T has been capitalized here. It is in capital T. Right? So, time has been also personified. The meaning of this line is, or maybe, that love cannot be fooled by time. Love cannot be fooled by time means true love does not change with the time. In that poem he says that a love is not love that alters with the alteration of time. Right? So he is not time's fool. Love is called as he, therefore it is personification, and time has been shown as deceiving or fooling, and therefore which fools someone, therefore it is also a personification, because this attribute of fooling others is only for human beings, right? Next example is, again it is by an American poet, Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. What does she say? Again, a well-known poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, in which Emily Dickinson has personified death throughout the poem. And here she says, because I could not stop for death, death has been personified by calling it as he, a man, typically a man. He kindly stopped for me. The attribute of kindness, the characteristic of kindness has been given to death. Death has been shown as kind. Therefore, the poet addresses death as he, that is man, who kindly stopped for the poet, who kindly stopped for the speaker in the poem. I hope these examples must have cleared this particular figure of speech in every manner. You must have understood this figure of speech. So, in this particular lecture, we have discussed definition of figure of speech, that is the words, arrangement of words basically to beautify and give the deeper meaning, have an effects of emotion, emotional effect, visual or sound effect. They do not only mean for decoration, but they also gives better meaning to the message in an effective way, in intense manner, and therefore they are significant in poetry. Then we saw simile. We also saw that in simile there are words of comparison. Metaphor is also called implied simile because it is also comparison between two distinct things or dissimilar things, but without the words of comparison. Then we also saw this unusual, little bit unusual figure of speech, conceit or metaphysical conceit, and how it shocks the readers. We saw that through this particular example, and we have discussed personification by these examples. I hope, friends, that you have understood these 4 figures of speech. If you have any doubts, you can always contact me. At the same time, the other figures of speech we will be discussing in next lectures. Thank you so much.